she said, just kill me fast. He had heard men beg for death in the low hours, after a bad cut, after a barroom fight, after a horse that broke a leg and took the rest of a day's wages with it, but never with the kind of small, tired dignity that came from the woman under the blanket. The cowboy, Cal, stood by the stove with the poker in his hand and felt the words settle like cold iron in his chest. They'd found her on the edge of the arroyo, face pressed into the dust like she was trying to disappear into the earth. The rain had just stopped, the grass steamed and smelled like old tobacco and distant lightning. The trailer's tarp was torn, her boots split down the sides. Her eyes were open when they picked her up, brown, the bright, weathered kind that had seen more than they should have. And when she looked at Cal, there was no calculation left in them. Only pleading. He'd brought her back to his bunkhouse because that was what people did. It wasn't noble. He had a loose conscience and an older dog that trusted him, and there was room by the stove if you leaned hard enough on the things you already owned. He hadn't been planning to become anybody's hero. Heroes cost more than a man made of patched denim could give. He knelt and pushed the blanket back slowly, like he was releasing a relic instead of a human being. The thing that made him stumble wasn't the wounds, he'd seen wounds, but the way the skin on her back had been carved into letters. Not words he could read, but a map of violence, scars that looked like stitches, places that still oozed dark and stubborn. Her ribs rose under a shirt that was one wash away from thread, her hair was a knotted, dusty halo. The blanket hid what it could, the blanket was the only decency left. She watched his face with a quiet that made his throat tight. I don't want to be like that, she whispered. Not anymore. Cal set the poker down. He had a habit of doing things slow, lighting the lantern, feeding the horse, unholstering his anger. Slow made room for thinking. He wrapped his calloused hand around hers. Her fingers were thin as matches and cold as the metal of a canteen left out overnight. You ain't asking a cowboy to shoot you, he said. Because there were certain desert truths. You could put a bullet in a man to end his pain, but you couldn't end the shame that had eaten at him. Death sometimes got you out of trouble. Sometimes it left the trouble like a stain on the rest of the world. She snorted, half laugh, half derisive thing. You think I want poetry? No. He swallowed. I think you want it over. She closed her eyes and the light from the lantern painted strange shadows on her cheek. I was taken, she said. The words came like she had been holding them underwater and finally let them loose. They told me it was work. I thought, God, I thought I'd be paid. I thought I'd be kept safe. I was wrong. Her mouth tightened. The rest dropped into a pocket of silence. Cal had met men who told him lies dressed as futures. He had also met women who'd learned to survive by being quieter than the men who wanted to own them. But the particular cruelty in the way she said it, like she had been dismantled by small, systematic things, stole his temper. Who did it? He asked. She looked at him as if she couldn't decide whether to risk more truth. Names don't matter when you have money, she said. Names don't help with the bruises. He wanted to knit her up with words, to tell her the universe had been cruel but could be convinced otherwise. He'd been a stubborn man on a stubborn land, stubbornness sometimes passed for virtue. But he knew the exact namelessness of her pain. You got a name? He asked, because names were the nearest thing to promise he knew. Leela, she breathed. It sounded like a thing she used to keep herself from being forgotten. Leela, he said. He repeated it like a prayer and the word felt like a tool, a way to fix something that wasn't completely broken yet. Cal fetched a pot of water and boiled it by the stove, the way his mother had taught him long ago. He didn't have a first aid kit. Only a drawer of tobacco tins, a roll of duct tape, and a small bottle of whiskey that smelled like someone else's rain. He poured the whiskey into a rag and cleaned the worst of the grime off her face. She flinched but didn't cry out. You gonna tell me what they did? He asked, not gentle. Honesty didn't tend to take scissors to soft things, sometimes it was a plumb line, the only way to see what was true. She told him, and the telling was a slow unspooling. Trucks at night, a chain of motels that never kept the same name for long, promises of a job at a diner that never existed. Men who smiled and then used fear like a hand. When she spoke of the others, women with the same hollowed cheeks, Cal felt a bile rising that was nearly holy in its anger. He had once lost a friend to a river and never found him, he had never been able to stop blaming the lazy currents. This was different, the currents were men who chose to steer. When she finished, the room seemed to rearrange itself. The dog at the foot of the bunk made a small sound and then settled back, indifferent and perfect. You want sleep? Cal asked finally. You want the sheriff? Saying the last word felt like calling a spell. The sheriff was more city than country, a man who had promised to care for a county full of secrets. Sometimes the sheriff helped. Sometimes the sheriff took his time. Leela looked at the window where the black poured in from the night. If I say yes, she said slowly, they'll find me. They'll know I talked. Cal thought of the men who had made her this way and how they moved like gnats, small, swarming, poisonous. He thought of the boy he used to be who'd shot a rattler because it had threatened the only chicken he had left. The shot had been clean. This would not be clean. Then we make them find us, he said. She laughed, a sound so thin it might have been a protest of the weather. That what you call help? You have horses, not armies. I have 2 horses, Cal admitted, and I know every side road from here to the interstate, and I'm not a man who likes being told, no. Her laugh settled into something like disbelief. You ain't exactly a prince, are you? Nope. He grinned, a crooked thing. Just a man who can't walk away. They set a plan that was as messy and human as anything else. A note written in cheap pencil, a whispered call to the one man Cal trusted in town. An old mechanic named Joe, and the idea of a place where Leela could disappear for a while. Cal had a cousin who owed him a favor and a small patch of land with an old shack and a well that hadn't been used in years. It wouldn't be permanent, it would be a place to breathe. But plans take time, and Leela needed something sooner than time could give. Cal stayed awake most of the night, tending to her wounds with whiskey and stitches pulled from thread he thought he had lost. He wrapped her back with strips of clean shirt. He told her about the horses, about the way rain changed the color of clay, about the stupid things he'd done as a young man. Words were a first aid measure of a different sort, they kept the darkness from rolling back in too quick. At dawn, when the first thin stuff of light threaded through the cracks in the trailer, she woke and reached for him with a trust that surprised him. Promise me something, she said. He looked at her. What? If I don't sleep through the day, and the nightmares come again, promise you. Won't pity me. Cal let out a breath he didn't know he'd held. I won't pity you. Don't stare at me like I'm fragile, she said. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance. He read the plea as one more piece of work for a man like him. Not to fix, but to stand steady while someone else learned to walk. I can do that, he said. I owe you less than that. Days passed and the sheriff came with his clipboard and his polite questions. Cal watched every step and answered only what he knew. The men Leela named were shadows in different towns, and the sheriff said he'd try. People like Cal learned patience the hard way. Waiting wasn't the same as trusting, but waiting was still something to do while you figured the next move. Leela learned what it was to keep a cup without looking at the handle. She learned to boil water and to braid her hair so it didn't catch on things. Sometimes she sat by the window and watched dust make slow, lazy patterns. Her skin mended in a way only the living can mend. Scar over scar like a map rewriting itself. On the 3rd week, when the sky looked like a raw sheet pulled tight, a truck rolled up outside. 2 men in a suit that didn't fit and a look like they had done this before stepped out. They asked for directions and for a place to sleep. Cal met them at the door with the kind of quiet that suggested a man who'd rather be anywhere else. They asked about a woman. He told them she wasn't there. They asked again, with teeth that showed more than their words. The dog growled. The men laughed and left, the sound of their tires peeling like a warning. Leela sat in the doorway, hands in her lap, and watched. She didn't cry, the tears had been spent back on the arroyo. You think they'll come back? She asked. Cal looked at the land, the horses, the horizon where thunder meant something without malice. He thought of the other things he'd promised people, his father, the sky, the horses, and how promises, once made, could be pulled back into being like a lariat. He straightened his shoulders. They might, he said. But if they do, they'll have to get through more than one man. She smiled then, not a huge smile. A small, honest thing. It made his chest ache in a way he liked, the ache that meant he was still living. When the men did come back, it was at dusk and with a swagger that smelled of old money and new cruelty. Cal met them with a lantern and a shotgun and an anger that belonged to a man who had decided the world would be different under his watch. The fight wasn't poetry. It was teeth and blood and the sound of things breaking. When it was over, the men were on the ground and the dog was licking at cuts that might scar. Cal sat on the tailgate of his pickup and watched stars prick the sky like old promises. Leela came out with a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him. For a long while neither of them spoke. The night hummed with cricket sounds and the slow breathing of a place that had not yet learned to forgive itself. "Did you ever think you'd be the man who stayed?" she asked. Cal looked at the horizon, at the slow seams of the land. He thought of every time he'd walked away because the going got hard. He thought, too, of the time his father slapped his hand away when he tried to help a stranger. "No," he said, "but I guess I wanted to be a man who could." Leela laid her head on his shoulder like an answer he hadn't known he needed. The blanket between them smelled of smoke and boiled coffee. It wasn't much. It was enough. The night after the fight was long. The wind rattled the boards of the old bunkhouse and every sound seemed amplified. Cal sat by the stove, shotgun leaned against the wall within reach, staring at the dull glow of the embers. Leela slept curled on the cot, her breath uneven, body tense even in rest. She twitched sometimes, her hands grasping at things unseen, her mouth forming silent words. Cal wanted to wake her, but he knew from his own nights of unrest that sometimes the body had to ride the storm out. He thought about the men lying broken in the dust outside. One had limped away, swearing vengeance, the other hadn't moved at all after Cal's final blow. Cal wasn't proud. Violence wasn't his first language, but it was a tongue he'd learned well enough when pushed. He wasn't sure if the sheriff would come nosing around again or if word would spread that the cowboy out past the arroyo wasn't one to mess with. Either way, the night felt changed. Something had shifted, as though the land itself had taken notice. When dawn came, Leela rose slowly, her face drawn but her eyes sharper than they'd been. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and watched Cal pour water into the coffee pot. The silence between them was different, no longer fragile, but thick with unspoken things. "You could have let them take me," she said finally. Cal looked over his shoulder. "Could have," he admitted. "Didn't. Why not?" He set the pot on the stove and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Because I've seen enough folks turned over to wolves. I'm tired of being the man who looks away." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she nodded. "Then I owe you." "No," he said quickly. "You don't owe me a damn thing. You owe yourself a life that isn't shackled to what they did. That's all." She studied him, as if weighing the truth of his words, then lowered her gaze. "A life," she murmured. "That's a big thing to owe myself." Days turned into weeks. The ranch was quiet except for the steady rhythm of chores. Cal taught Leela how to saddle a horse, how to mend a fence, how to move slow and sure through work that demanded patience. She picked things up quickly, though her body betrayed the scars of what had been done to her. She winced when lifting too much, faltered when the nightmares crept back in. But she refused to stop. Stubbornness, Cal realized, was stitched into her bones. Sometimes, in the evenings, they sat outside and watched the horizon bleed into purple and gold. She'd ask him about the land, how long he'd been here, why he stayed when so many left for easier lives. He told her the truth, that the land had raised him, that its silence was a companion he couldn't abandon, that even when it broke him down it gave him something worth keeping. She listened as if trying to anchor herself to that same steadiness. One evening, as the sun sank low, she said, "Do you ever wonder if the land remembers everything? The good and the bad?" Cal chewed on the thought before answering. "I think it does. But it doesn't hold grudges. It just keeps going. Like the river that don't stop for nobody." She looked out across the fields, her expression unreadable. "Then maybe I can be like that." He wanted to tell her she already was, but he kept quiet. Some truths were better discovered than handed over. The men who had hurt her weren't done. Word came through Joe, the mechanic, that strangers had been asking questions in town. Men with city boots and hard eyes, carrying pictures that matched Lella's face. Cal felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a stone. He knew they wouldn't stop. Wolves didn't give up their prey willingly. That night, he told Leela. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, listening. When he finished, she said, "Then we need to go." He blinked. "Go. To that place you said your cousin owns. The shack with the well. You told me about it. Maybe that's where I can start over." Cal studied her. She wasn't running from fear anymore, he could see it in her eyes. She was choosing to move forward. You sure? He asked. Yes. So they packed what little they had. Cal saddled the horses at dawn, loading them with supplies, water, food, the tools they'd need. Leela stood beside him, the blanket still draped over her shoulders, her hair braided tight. She looked smaller than she was, but her posture was straighter now, less beaten down. As they rode out, the land stretched wide and unforgiving before them. The sky was a pale, endless blue, the kind that made you feel both insignificant and invincible. Leela rode behind him, quiet but steady, her hands gripping the saddle horn. The rhythm of the horse carried them forward, away from the ghosts that had haunted her. The shack was rough, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it stood solid against the wind. The well was shallow, the water gritty but drinkable. To Leela, it was sanctuary. She walked the small space, touching the walls, the broken stove, the creaking door. She turned to Cal and said, "This will do." They set to work making it livable. Cal patched the holes in the roof, Leela swept out the dust and cobwebs. Together they built a fire in the old stone hearth, the smoke curling up into the evening sky. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. As the days slipped by, Leela grew stronger. Her hands blistered from work, her back ached from lifting, but she didn't complain. She learned to draw water from the well, to start a fire without flinching at the sparks, to ride the horse without fear of falling. She laughed sometimes now, a sound that surprised them both. One night, sitting by the fire, she asked Cal, "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling like they own me?" He stared into the flames. "They don't own you. They never did. They just tried to make you forget you belong to yourself." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "And if I forget again, then I'll remind you," he said simply. The weeks turned into months. Leela's hair grew long and healthy, her face filled out, the hollow look fading. She was still marked by what had happened, both in scars and in the way she sometimes woke in the night gasping, but she was no longer just surviving. She was living. The men who hunted her didn't stop, but they grew quieter. The sheriff made arrests in a nearby county, breaking up part of the ring that had held her. Cal knew the danger wasn't gone, but it had lessened. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope like a tangible thing. One evening, after a long day of work, Leela sat on the porch of the shack, watching the sunset. Cal sat beside her, sipping coffee. She turned to him and said, "I used to think I'd never be more than what they made me. But you showed me otherwise." He shook his head. "You showed yourself. I just stood here long enough for you to see it." She smiled then, a real smile, wide and unguarded. It was the kind of smile that made the world feel worth the fight. Cal knew there was still a road ahead, rough and uncertain. But as he sat there beside her, the sky painted in fire and shadow, he realized something he hadn't dared admit before: they weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning again. And that, he thought, was more powerful than any revenge, more lasting than any fear. The shack became more than shelter. It was a place where silence had space to grow into comfort, where every small act of repair, nailing a loose board, stacking stones along the foundation, sweeping away dust, wasn't just about making a home but about reclaiming pieces of themselves they hadn't known were missing. For Leela, each swing of the hammer was a declaration. She was not broken wood left to rot, not discarded fabric, not ruined flesh. She was still here, standing, shaping something with her own hands. For Cal, it was a kind of redemption he'd never asked for but needed anyway, a chance to prove to himself that he could be more than a man who drifted through the world carrying only his own weight. The days took on rhythm. Morning started with the cool draw from the well, steam from boiling water curling like whispers against the ceiling. Cal would tend to the horses while Leela fed the chickens he'd bartered for from Joe. They'd share cornbread and beans when they had them, dried jerky welling water curling like whispers against the ceiling. Cal would tend to the horses while Leela fed the chickens he'd bartered for from Joe. They'd share cornbread and beans when they had them, dried jerky when they didn't, and on rare days a rabbit caught by Cal's steady hand with the rifle. Work followed. Mending, hauling, fixing, surviving. Then, when the day gave way to the lavender of evening, they would sit outside, letting the land remind them it was bigger than both their pains. Leela grew stronger, not just in her body but in her voice. She no longer kept her eyes fixed on the ground when speaking, she no longer folded into herself when shadows stretched long. She asked questions now. She asked about Cal's past, about the mother who'd raised him hard and the father who'd left too soon. She asked about the wars of men and the wars of the land, about the scars on his knuckles and the limp he carried in his left knee. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't, but what mattered was that she asked, and that he listened when she chose to speak of her own ghosts. It wasn't easy. Nights still came where her screams tore through the walls, where she woke clawing at the air as though unseen hands held her down. Cal would rise, not touching her unless she reached first, but speaking to her low and steady, reminding her of the fire, of the shack, of the sky waiting for her return. Sometimes she'd collapse against him, trembling, and sometimes she'd push him away, desperate for space. He gave her both. He never left. One night, after one of those storms passed, she sat on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in the old blanket. Her voice was hoarse when she said, "You ever wonder if some wounds never close? Like they keep bleeding inside, no matter how much time passes." Cal crouched beside her, poking the embers with the iron rod. "Sure," he said. "I figure some wounds ain't meant to close. They just change how you walk. How you see the world." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you live with that?" "Been living with mine long enough," he said. "Ain't easy. But you find ways to keep moving." Her eyes lingered on his face, then dropped to her hands. "Then maybe I can too." Seasons shifted. The air turned sharp, mornings crisp with frost. Cal showed her how to stack wood, how to seal the gaps in the walls with clay to keep the drafts out. They worked side by side, breath visible in the cold. Lella's laughter came more often now, surprising even her. Once, when Cal slipped on ice and landed flat on his back with a curse that echoed off the trees, she laughed so hard she nearly dropped the bucket she was carrying. He lay there in the snow, grinning up at her, and realized that sound was worth every bruise. But the world outside the shack hadn't forgotten them. Strangers still came through town asking questions. Joe passed word whenever he heard something, his voice grave over the crackling phone line in the small general store where Cal went to pick up supplies. "They're still lookin', Cal," Joe warned one night. Not as loud as before, but steady. Like men who got time and money to burn. Cal thanked him and hung up, jaw tight. He didn't tell Leela right away. He wanted to shield her, to let her keep building this fragile new life without the weight of the hunt pressing down. But Leela wasn't a woman easily shielded anymore. She saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the horizon more often, and she asked. When he finally told her, she didn't collapse into fear. She didn't beg to run again. She only nodded and said, "Then let them come. I'm not theirs anymore." Her resolve struck him harder than any fist. She wasn't just surviving now. She was fighting. Winter deepened, and with it came hardship. Food grew scarce, and there were nights when they went to sleep hungry, bellies hollow but spirits stubborn. The cold crept into their bones no matter how much wood they burned. Cal worried she'd falter, that her body, still healing, wouldn't withstand it. But Leela surprised him. She endured, teeth clenched, shoulders squared. She spoke less of the past and more of the future, small dreams, like planting a garden come spring, or getting a second horse so she could ride beside him instead of behind. One night, when the wind howled like wolves around the shack, she asked him, "Do you believe in second lives? Not heaven or hell, just another chance, here, after everything." Cal thought about it, staring at the flames. "I believe in people changing," he said. "I believe in getting up after you've been knocked down. Maybe that's the same thing." She leaned closer to the fire, the orange glow painting her scarred face in warmth. "Then maybe this is mine," she whispered. Spring finally came, and with it, renewal. Snow melted into rushing streams, grass pushed up green and stubborn through the dirt. Leela planted seeds in a small patch of ground behind the shack, beans, corn, herbs Joe had given them in paper packets. She knelt in the soil, hands dirty, hair falling loose around her face, and she looked more alive than Cal had ever seen her. Watching her, he felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't dared name. He tried to bury it, that growing pull, because he feared it would burden her. She needed freedom, not chains of affection she might not want. But the more time they spent together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the trust, the harder it became to deny. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "You've given me more than a home, Cal. You've given me back myself." He swallowed, throat thick. "You did that," he said. "I just stood here long enough for you to see it." Her hand brushed his then, tentative but deliberate. He didn't move, afraid to shatter the moment. Her fingers lingered, and when she looked at him, there was something new in her eyes, something fragile, yes, but also fierce. The world beyond them hadn't vanished. The men who hunted her were still out there, their reach long and their cruelty deeper than most could fathom. Cal knew one day they might come again, and when they did, he'd stand in front of her with every ounce of strength he had. But for now, in that fading light, with her hand against his, there was no fear. There was only the slow, stubborn bloom of something worth fighting for. And when she leaned her head against his shoulder, the sky burning with fire and dusk, he let himself believe, not in miracles, not in perfect endings, but in the simple, defiant truth that sometimes survival wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes, it was the beginning of a new one. The summer came hot and relentless, the kind that baked the earth until cracks split wide across the ground and even the shade of the shack felt heavy with heat. Cal and Leela worked through it, sweat soaking their shirts, skin bronzed and toughened by the sun. The garden thrived under her care, stubborn plants pushing their way up through the soil, a small patch of green against the harshness of the land. Every sprout was proof she could coax life from something nearly barren, proof that she wasn't cursed to destruction but blessed with creation. Cal watched her with quiet admiration, the way she knelt in the dirt, patient and focused, how she carried herself now with a strength that hadn't been there before. She laughed more, she sang under her breath when she thought he wasn't listening, and sometimes she'd walk to the ridge at sunset and just stand there, arms open, as if daring the sky to try and cage her again. She was no longer just surviving. She was claiming her place in the world, and Cal knew it was the most remarkable thing he'd ever witnessed. But peace is a fragile thing, and the world has a way of testing those who dare to claim it. It was late one evening when the first sign came. Cal was out by the corral, mending a post, when he heard the faint crunch of tires on gravel far down the road. He froze, heart thudding. Few people came out this far without reason, and fewer still without warning. He scanned the horizon and saw the faint plume of dust rising, steady and deliberate. His gut told him what his mind didn't want to admit, the past had found them. He didn't rush to tell Leela right away. She was inside, humming softly as she prepared supper, the smell of beans and fresh cornbread filling the air. He stood at the doorway, watching her, memorizing the curve of her smile as she glanced up and caught him staring. For a moment he wanted to pretend it was nothing, just some lost traveler. But he'd learned long ago that lies, even kind ones, had a way of cutting deeper later. "There's someone coming," he said, voice low. Her hands stilled. She set the spoon down slowly, eyes narrowing, shoulders tensing in that old, familiar way. "How many?" "Don't know yet," he admitted. "But it ain't friendly." She nodded once, no fear in her eyes now, only determination. "Then we'll face it." They prepared in silence. Cal checked the shotgun, loaded the rifle, made sure the horses were secured. Leela rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair back, and stood by the door with a kitchen knife in her hand. She didn't look like the broken woman he had found under a blanket months ago. She looked like someone who had burned away weakness in the fire of her suffering and come out forged into steel. The truck arrived as the sun dipped low, dust swirling around it like a storm. Two men climbed out, rough-looking, city-hardened, their eyes scanning the land with the arrogance of predators who believed nothing could touch them. One of them smiled when he saw Cal standing there, gun across his arms. "Evening," the man said, voice slick. "We're looking for someone. Figure you might have seen her. Brown hair, scars on her back. Goes by Leela." Cal's grip tightened. He kept his voice even. "Ain't nobody here by that name." The man chuckled, glancing at his partner. "Funny. Folks in town said otherwise." Inside, Leela stood frozen, listening. Every muscle in her body screamed to run, to hide, but she didn't. She stepped out into the doorway, the fading light catching her face. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not going back." The men's smiles widened, cruel and certain. "Oh, sweetheart," one of them said. "You don't get to decide." Before Cal could move, Leela lifted the knife, her hand trembling but firm. "I do now," she said. The moment stretched, the air thick with tension, then exploded into chaos. The man lunged forward, and Cal's shotgun roared, the blast echoing across the land. Dust rose, horses screamed, and Leela darted forward, slashing with the knife, her face a mask of fury. It was fast, brutal, clumsy, but it was real. They fought not just with weapons but with everything they'd carried, the rage, the pain, the years stolen. When it was over, the men lay broken in the dirt, groaning, bleeding, their arrogance shattered. Cal stood over them, chest heaving, shotgun still warm. Leela knelt beside one, pressing the knife to his throat. Her voice low and trembling with power. "Tell them," she hissed. "Tell everyone, you don't own me. You don't own any of us. If they come again, they'll die here too." The man's eyes widened with real fear, and he nodded frantically. She rose, shaking, and Cal gently took the knife from her hand. He didn't speak, just looked at her, and in that look was everything: pride, sorrow, relief, and something deeper that words couldn't hold. They let the men crawl back to their truck and disappear into the night, battered and broken, carrying with them the message that Leela was no longer prey. When the dust settled, Leela collapsed against Cal, her body trembling, tears streaking her face. But these weren't the tears of despair he'd seen before. They were tears of release, of defiance, of something breaking free inside her at last. Cal held her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other stroking her hair. "It's over," he whispered, though he knew it might not be. "You're safe now." She pulled back, meeting his eyes, and for the first time there was no shadow in hers. "I believe you," she said softly. In the days that followed, the shack felt different. The air was lighter, the silence no longer haunted. Leela walked with her head high, shoulders straight, as if she had finally shed the weight of chains she'd carried for too long. She worked the garden, tended the animals, laughed with a fullness Cal had never heard before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living, and Cal knew he would carry the memory of her transformation for the rest of his days. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sky turn to fire, Leela reached for his hand. Her fingers twined with his, warm and certain. "You saved me," she said. He shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just stood beside you while you did." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Then maybe we saved each other." Cal didn't argue. He knew it was true. He had found her broken, begging for death, and in saving her he had found a reason to live again himself. They were both scarred, both carrying wounds that would never fully fade, but together they had turned pain into strength, silence into laughter, survival into life. The land stretched out before them, vast and unyielding, but for the first time it felt like home. And as the stars emerged, one by one, Leela whispered into the night, "This is my second life. And I'm not giving it up." Cal squeezed her hand, heart swelling with something he'd long thought lost. "Then I'll walk it with you," he said. And there, beneath the endless sky, they sat together, two broken souls remade, not by miracles or fate, but by grit, by defiance, by the simple, stubborn will to keep going. The night held them, and the world, for once, felt like it could be enough.